And joining us now is Chris McGreal, who is a senior writer for The Guardian US and a former correspondent in Jerusalem and Johannesburg. He has published several articles on the opioid epidemic in America, and his latest book is American Overdose, the Opioid Tragedy in 3 Acts. And he has an article at The Guardian, ALEC is driving laws to blacklist companies that boycott the oil industry. Welcome to Background Briefing, Chris McGreal.
Thank you.
Well, thanks for joining us. And today there were hearings before the House Oversight and Reform Committee. They had an earlier hearing in October where a group of oil company executives were put on the record about climate change denial. But today they didn't show up, right? Critics of the oil industry showed up, but not the oil executives themselves. So what did you make of that?
Well, it was the board members for the 4 major companies, the 2 American, Exxon and Chevron, and then 2 European, Shell and BP. They'd invited board members to come and testify. They didn't show up. A second hearing has been scheduled for next month, at which they will be invited again. And it wasn't clear. I mean, it came out in the hearing that they'd said the timing was bad, so it didn't appear that it was an outright refusal. But of course, a big test will be whether they turn up in next month. If they don't, then of course that will be taken as a deliberate snub, as a refusal to come and answer questions of the committee, which was trying to discover. It was probing whether the oil industry is really making commitments to cut carbon emissions, or essentially pursuing a public relations campaign to get the criticism over its part in the climate crisis off its back.
Well, the chairwoman of the committee, Carolyn Maloney, she sort of hinted that they might subpoena them next time for the hearing scheduled for March the 8th. Quoting her, if they do not agree to appear, the committee will use every tool at its disposal to get the information we need. Seems like more. Seems like she's turning the screws there.
It does a little bit. I mean, she's also, I think, referring to the fact that the oil industry has refused to release a lot of documents. Although those documents have been subpoenaed, not all of them have been handed over. And one of the questions they wanted to put to the board members was, why are your companies not handing these documents over? What do you know about it? So they're pressing for those documents, which, one assumes the oil industry is hanging on to because they're extremely embarrassing. But yes, it will be interesting to see whether they go so far as to then subpoena the board members as well.
And instead of the board members of the oil companies, Michael Mann, for example, distinguished professor of atmospheric science at Pennsylvania State University, he testified. He talked about the oil industry's activities as like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. And of course, some of the Republicans on the committee came to the defense of the oil industry, suggesting that they provide good paying jobs and energy for all Americans. So just before we get to talking about your article, ALEC is driving laws to blacklist companies that boycott the oil industry. Chris, what did you make of today's hearings? Was there anything useful?
Oh, I wouldn't say they were particularly enlightening. They're quite furious at times, and lots of speeches were given by various members of Congress. I mean, Michael Mann, who's a professor and climate specialist at Pennsylvania State University, has long documented the change in the climate, essentially made the point that a lot of the promises being made by the oil industry are really a cover. That they say that they're going to cut emissions from productions per gallon from productions effectively, but 2 things are going on here. Firstly, that they're intending to increase their production over the next decades, so their overall emissions will go up. But also, they're only committing to the production, to the drilling side of it, when 90% of emissions actually come from burning those fuels in people's cars and in other ways. So it's a very limited commitment. And he was making the point. He said I think the parallel he drew was like telling your doctor you're going to cut back on the amount of potato chips you eat by eating low-fat ones, but then eating twice as many. He said the end result isn't any better. And so That was his overall point. He came under quite a lot of attack, as did some of the other witnesses from Republicans who said, well, the Chinese and the Russians are polluting more, or they're increasing their production, and whose side are you really on here? And there was a lot of talk about America needing to be have energy freedom, as it was put by somebody who testified from the Heritage Foundation. It was all very ideological and not particularly enlightening, I have to say.
And just in reference to your earlier remarks about the subpoenaed documents that the oil companies have yet to turn over, what's already come out now from those earlier hearings is some of these embarrassing documents, an Exxon paper in 1988 saying we should emphasize the uncertainty of scientific conclusions regarding the potential enhanced greenhouse effect, stress environmentally sound adaptive efforts. Victory will be achieved when average citizens understand and recognize uncertainties in climate science. And then in 2000, ExxonMobil managed to get a advertorial, I guess it's called, in the New York Times, headlined Unsettled Science. So there's quite a bit on the record about climate denial.
Yes, there is. And I mean, one of the things that came up again at the hearings is that, back in the 70s, Exxon scientists were doing research which told them exactly what was going to happen to the climate, and it proved to be pretty accurate on the whole. Once Exxon was confronted with this in the early 80s, it then shut down the research effectively and hid the results, and has been distorting that science, as Caroline Malone, the chair of the committee, put it, lying about it ever since. And so we know quite a lot of what Exxon in particular knew at the time and what it did to cover it up, and also to pursue a strategy where it tried to shift responsibility away from the oil industry and onto the consumer, and to say, no, it's your job as an ordinary American to cut back on climate emissions, on greenhouse gas emissions, not us as oil companies that are producing the fuels that you're burning.
And again, I'm speaking with Chris McGreal, who's a senior writer for The Guardian US and a former correspondent in Jerusalem and Johannesburg. He's published several articles on the opioid epidemic in America, and his latest book is American Overdose, The Opioid Tragedy in Three Acts. And he has an article at The Guardian, ALEC is driving laws to blacklist companies that boycott the oil industry. So let's talk about the role of ALEC, which is in part funded by the Koch brothers, who are very much in the oil pipeline and refining business. The states of Texas have already passed these laws, and now the legislatures in West Virginia and Oklahoma and Indiana are introducing a version of this law drafted by ALEC called the Energy Discrimination Elimination Act. I take it that this kind of cookie-cutter law that ALEC is famous for, just basically handing it over to Republican legislatures in a lot of the states across the country, it's based upon the BDS anti-boycott law against Israel.
Yes, that's right. ALEC had a hand in drafting that, the AntiBDS, the anti-boycott, divestment and sanctions movement laws, which essentially, well, the original draft of those laws actually went after individuals and said, for example, as it turned out, people like teachers in Kentucky and other individuals who were on state contracts would have to sign commitments not to boycott Israel or not to take any action that would lead to a boycott of Israel in support of BDS. Those have been struck down by courts around and about, and some states have had to change those laws. So now they're principally aimed at companies. And what they say is that any company that wants a contract with a state public entity, or have investments from a state public entity, like, for instance, a state teachers' pension fund, has to commit not to boycott Israel. That is now being extended to not boycotting the oil industry, and also another move by the weapons manufacturers to not boycotting the arms industry. So they've used that model to try and discourage any form of public pressure against the oil industry over the climate crisis.
But these anti-BDS legislation, there's an element of absurdity in it. I mean, as you point out in your article, Chris McGreal, the residents of Dickinson, Texas were required to sign a pledge not to boycott Israel in order to receive hurricane damage relief. And a teacher in Kansas was told that she had to do the same to keep her job. There's a First Amendment issue involved in here in suing against these anti-boycott laws. Could that be employed against the oil companies? I mean, they're already being sued all over the place, and that's largely what's motivating to do what they're doing, isn't it?
Yes, so it seems that ALEC has learned the lessons of what went wrong with their anti-BDS laws, in the sense that they went after the individuals in the way that you're saying. So what essentially is happening with the oil industry, what it's been really worried about, is the fact that banks and investment firms are pulling back from investment. This was partly sparked by the refusal of some banks to invest in to give loans and invest in the drilling in the Arctic. That alarmed Alaska in particular, which tried to move against it. And what these laws do is essentially require big corporations, anybody that employs more than 10 people, but essentially they're going after the big investment firms. Essentially what they're trying to do is to force larger corporations, potentially financial corporations and banks, not to withdraw funding, not to withdraw loans or other forms of investment from the oil industry. That's what this is aimed at, because they're aware that partly under shareholder pressure, public pressure in general, that some of the banks are now starting to step back. They are working into their commitments that they will be climate friendly, that they won't back certain forms of energy. For instance, big pressure to withdraw from the coal industry, investments in the coal industry. Now, oil is very afraid that that will be extended to them. And as I said, that has already been extended to issues around loans for drilling in the Arctic. So this is a measure to try and head that off, really.
Well, apparently they're targeting Blackrock, which is a big hedge fund investment vehicle that has, something like $10 trillion. And the state of Texas is going to deny them, $20 billion? Is it? Do I have these figures right? Via their pension funds?
So Texas has already passed this law. It was the first state to do so. It passed it last June. And so Texas has started to draw up lists of companies that it says are effectively boycotting the oil industry. And the lieutenant governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, has now moved to put Blackrock, which is the world's largest asset manager, as you say, $10 trillion, top of its list. So it's blacklisting the blacklisters effectively. Now, BlackRock says they're not blacklisting at all. They're simply shifting their emphasis away in some ways from fossil fuels. They actually remain very heavily invested in certain kinds of fossil fuels through broad energy funds, the market funds. But Patrick thinks that BlackRock being so big is setting a bad example. He's actually accused the BlackRock chairman and CEO, Larry Fink, of kind of making reassuring statements in private to the state by saying that the company was, and the quote here from Patrick, committed to Texas and Texas's vast energy footprint, but then taking a different position in public by pledging to pressure energy firms to work towards net carbon zero. Anyway, one way or the other, BlackRock has ended up top of Texas's blacklist. And as you say, that would mean they'd lose about a $20 billion Texas public sector pension fund investment. It's not clear how much more than that it would cost BlackRock. But this is, meant to be sending a message out to companies, financial companies, that Texas will move against them.
So this Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Dan Patrick, a former right-wing talk show host, he's obviously up for re-election, being challenged by the former Republican operative Matthew Dowd. But also you've got Senator Ted Cruz carrying water for ALEC and for the oil companies, along with former Governor Rick Perry. So how would you characterize the kind of order of battle here between the environmentalists and the Texans? It would seem to me that public opinion is largely shifting in favor of the environmentalists, is it not?
I think it is, but I don't think that would necessarily be true in Texas. And I think the Republican political leadership in Texas thinks it's really got nothing to lose by going out and fighting as hard as it can for companies like Exxon. I mean, there's actually a case that's expected to come up before the Texas Supreme Court, where Exxon's effectively attempting to sue California officials that are suing it. And the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, who appointed half of the members of the Texas Supreme Court, actually wrote to the court urging them to find in favor of Exxon. And in all of that, you see Exxon and the oil industry as a whole very much portrayed in terms of, this is what keeps Texas going. This is crucial to us. We have to defend it at every turn. And I think that's what this is about. More broadly across the country, yes, absolutely, you're right, there's a shift. But I don't think that shift is something that's having a big impact on Texas politics right now.
And you mentioned California suing along with Hawaii and Rhode Island. They're suing under the notion of these oil companies creating a public nuisance. Just in closing then, is there any chance that these Wall Street hedge funds and asset managers with this immense power and these huge amounts, 10 trillion that BlackRock controls, can win this battle against the oil companies? I mean, the biggest companies in the world now are all these Silicon Valley tech companies like Alphabet and Google and Microsoft and Apple, etc. So it was only a few years ago that ExxonMobil was the most powerful, richest company in the world, but they've been eclipsed. But they've still got some power, haven't they?
Yeah, they have. I mean, I think, this is the issue of our age, the climate crisis. And I think in the end, BlackRock saying, look, it's going to back away from burning fossil fuels, backing companies that burn fossil fuels, won't lose it a lot of support away from places like Texas. I think that, as we heard at the hearing today, that the oil industry is fighting hard, but it is on the back foot. It is clearly, it's gone from denying climate science or saying that the jury's out on climate science to now saying it accepts the science, but then essentially trying to massage the figures. So I think, that reality extends to lots of things, including financial investment. I mean, BlackRock, $10 trillion of investments, and only $20 billion of that comes from the Texas public sector. So I think that they think they can probably afford to lose the business. They may take a public relations hit, and that might overall hit their business, but they'll be weighing that up against being seen to fund things like Arctic drilling. And I think we probably know that the broad kind of drift of public opinion, as you said earlier, is increasingly against at least the way the oil companies, the major oil companies are operating now, and their intent to not only carry on as they are, but to increase drilling. And I can't imagine that the big financial companies think that's something that they've really got it's in their interests to ally themselves with.
Well, Chris McGreal, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
My pleasure.
And again, I've been speaking with Chris McGreal, who's a senior writer for The Guardian US and a former correspondent in Jerusalem and Johannesburg. He's published several articles on the opioid epidemic in America, and his latest book is American Overdose, The Opioid Tragedy in 3 Acts. And he has an article at The Guardian, ALEC is driving laws to blacklist companies that boycott the